Hello, everybody. Dr. Rick back at you, sharing with you again. I tell you, we're going to be doing readings on some of my most influential books throughout the remainder of the year. Next up is Born in Captivity. Born in Captivity is my ninth book. Um, it's a very comprehensive and detailed book. Um, it's a little bit technical in many areas, but for the average reader, you could still get it, and definitely the average reader will get it. But we're going to read it out and we're going to talk about it. We're going to break it down. We're going to talk about the tenets pushed forth in this book. Again, everything I do is with purpose. I am so grateful for the opportunity that I have had to express myself in so many different ways, one of which being in writing. I've been writing all of my life. I've had my first published article while I was still in school, high school. And so I've been doing this for a while. I've been public speaking longer than that. And I was just telling someone on another platform that even though I've done 24 books, and I just finished reading book number 24, Academic Apartheid. And I said, even though I've done 24 books, it still is a blessing and still amazing. And, my office is literally a couple of lights down from a Barnes and Noble store. And I'll still stop in there occasionally and just ask for one of my titles and watch them pull it up and go find it, and then look at the picture and see the guy that wrote the book is standing in front of them. And it's just like, hey, you're doing what you said you were going to do. You're having an impact. And while it may not seem like it in some instances and sometimes because the work you do is so immensely overwhelming, it's happening. So I'm excited about that. So let's get into this book. I'm going to now the chapter we're reading is what is it? Chapter 11, and these chapters are intensive, but they're broken down into subsections. And it's going to take a while to get through this chapter. So we're not doing it all today, but we're going to do it in succession until we finish the chapter because it all focuses on one thing. The title of the chapter is an identity crisis. It's so important to the entire psychology of success and healing to understand who you are. And we have a problem. And so I'm going to read the first section of this, which is basically introduction to the chapter. And I'm going to go through the uh, first couple of subsections. This won't take long, but I do want to kind of get you into it before we stop. All right. It says one of the most devastating impacts of slavery is that it robbed blacks of their identity. The knowledge of self is paramount to the advancement of any people, and blacks are no different. The psychological legacy of slavery is a poor self image that is fostered by the lack of knowledge of self. This was accomplished through a complex system of subjugation in which an entire group of people were forcefully removed from their own land and taken to a foreign country where they were stripped of their religion, or more importantly, here, spirituality, their history, and their name. Franz Fanon addresses the alienation, this type of alienation of self in his work, Black Skin, White Mask. Quoting Franz Fanon, if psychiatry is the medical technique that aims to enable man no longer to be a stranger to his environment, I owe to myself to affirm that the Arab, permanently an alien in his own country, lives in a state of absolute depersonalization. The social structure existing in Algeria was hostile to any attempt to put the individual back where he belonged. What End of quotation. What Fanon is expressing in this passage is his concern for the extremity of this type of alienation of the personal identity that was being suppressed through the collective oppression and social antagonism of a specific group. As Fanon explores the psychological dynamic of the way the ambivalence associated with being an alien in an environment in which the victim must call home, be forced to confront how that ambivalence impacts the individual identity and the negative impact it produces. Not only does the social antagonism produce the psychoanalytic ambivalence of the unconscious, but it also serves an antithetical force to the phenomenological of affirmation of self and the group at large. There's so much power in your identity. Your identity is the affirmation of your purpose. Your identity is the affirmation of where you are, what you're doing, where you're going. So it's so important to understand that. Then it says, I suggest that Fanon was struggling from within the metaphor of a specific vision that was highly complicit with a westernized metaphysic manifestation of human individualism. The West, there we go. Fanon even implies that it was necessary to minimize the presence of the Black identity because the Black identity innately challenges the representative narrative of the white existence, especially in the area of supremacy and superiority. Just being knowing a sense of who you are is a threat. That's why Black men who are unarmed are such a threat. When you stand tall, when you know who you are, when you're not fearful, when you're not easily pushed into a corner, you just are a threat. Your very presence is powerful. While Fanon's lament in this work is focused on colonialism, which is another form of national subjugation distinctively different from slavery, the alienation of one's individual self, the human identity, is what is being discussed here. Much in the same manner that colonialism interfered with the natural order of the development of individual identity of those who were being oppressed under its power, American chattel slavery fundamentally undermined the natural progression of human psychological development, producing a constellation of delirium that served to mediate the normal social relations of those whom fell underneath its power. Ultimately, the Black identity was suppressed for the sake of preserving the white narrative and the white identity. The dilemma of the African American can be effectively reduced to the absence of an individual and collective identity. Self-identity is essential to the development of positive self-image and subsequently a positive self-esteem. The answer to the question, who am I, is the beginning of the process of exploring all the possibilities and probabilities of life. It is the foundation upon which one's expectations for themselves are established. Can you imagine having the identity of a slave? You get where I'm going here. For elucidation, self-identity refers to the global understanding that a person has of themselves. Self-identity is composed of relative permanent self-assessments such as personality, attributes, knowledge of one's skills and abilities, one's occupations and hobbies, and awareness of one's physical attributes. The discovery of one's identity cannot be considered an a priori, and neither can it be considered a finished product. It is a dynamic that is constant and based on having a lucid access to an impressed image of oneself in totality. When the image is marred, ambivalent, or nebulous, in its presentation of one's identity, the process of discovery becomes troubled, uncertain, and even hostile. In examining the influence of cognitive distortion on the mental health of social mobility of the African Americans, the lack of a clear understanding of self is significant in developing understanding of how the consistency of distorted cognitions is perpetuated throughout generations. In other words, when you don't know who you are, you're easily manipulated into false perceptions of yourself, false images of yourself. That's where self-hatred comes from. It's easy to keep you subjugated. It's easy to keep you. You don't enslave the person through shackles. You enslave their mind. The first way that you enslave the mind is to attack the identity. If you attack the identity and they lose a sense of self, they lose a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, a sense of where they should be. Eventually, they forget that they're not where they're supposed to be. They start to buy into the identity that wherever they're at is their lot in life. That's what Frantz Fanon was talking about with the Arabs in Algiers. Okay. So Fanon views the dilemma of non-identity with such despair that he introduced his dissertation on colonialism by presenting a climactic proposal. Here's the quote. The problem is important. I propose nothing short of the liberation of the man of color from himself. when your identity is marred, you literally have to liberate yourself from yourself. In other words, you've got to liberate yourself from the marred image, from the falsified identity. In other words, you got a bunch of people in America, blacks in America, that are struggling with inferiority complexes that lead to self-hatred. You got to liberate yourself from the person you see in that space and introduce yourself to the person you truly are, and embrace the beauty of your blackness, the beauty of your brilliance, the beauty of your power. That's the thing that we're talking about here. Fanon viewed the current mental state of the black man to be in such a nefarious state that the only cure was to be liberated from himself. What is meant by the idea of liberating the black man from himself? A comprehensive anatomization of this work suggests that the interference with the development of the individual the individual development of the black man's self-identity by force of colonialism had injected the black psyche with an insidious and destructive psychopathy that rendered him ineffective to function in his own best interests. Who else talked about that? Who else talked about that in a book probably 90, 80, 85, 90 years ago? Carter G. Woodson in The Miseducation of the Negro. Same thing. You literally have been indoctrinated into an identity and had an image inculcated into your psyche at the level that now you cannot act on your own best interest. Carter G. Woodson said, when a black man's mind has been properly manipulated, you don't have to tell him to go to the back door. He will insist upon doing it. If there's not a back door, he will insist that one be made. That's the power of this thing. That's the power of identity. That's the power of self. That's the power of knowing. It says, another quote from Fanon says, "I am talking of millions of men who have been skillfully injected with fear, inferiority, complexes, trepidation, servility, despair, and abasement." Here's a note. When Fanon uses the word man, it usually bears the connotation of the phenomenological quality of humanness, inclusive of man and woman, generally ignoring the question of gender difference. It is not that there are not distinctive issues that arise based on gender difference, but it is Fanon's belief that these issues associated with gender difference can be best addressed through engaging the enigmatic social and cultural dilemmas which encompass them. Addressing all the issues through the platform of a shared origin creates the commonality through which both genders are eternally and inextricably connected. So when he's talking about black men, he's actually in the same way, I guess, that the book of Genesis in the Bible does. When he says God created man, it's actually, if you go ahead and read on, he said he made them male and female. So man was both male and female. Just something to be aware of. American chattel slavery served as one of the most dehumanizing mechanisms ever unleashed on any group throughout history. Slaves were given the last names of their slave masters to represent the fact that they were property and that they had no rights. This was also a very subtle method of blurring the lines of identity. In a culture such as the one in America, very little emphasis is placed on the chosen or the surname of an individual. However, a person's name has an immense impact on their sense of identity and their self-image. In many Eastern cultures, including many African cultures, a great deal goes into choosing the name of a newborn. The name will have a direct impact on how the child views themselves. In many of these Eastern cultures, names are often extracted from the family tree or related to specific events that took place during the pregnancy. In whatever process that was used to choose the name, it had meaning, and it established the baseline of what the child was to expect from themselves. To take away a name from a slave and to give them a new name that was indicative of their current situation allowed the slave masters to lay the foundation for optimal subjugation. It was not only the renaming of the slaves through which this dynamic took its toll, the fact that the right and authority for a slave to choose the name for their progeny was not completely theirs also contributed to the identity crisis. The manipulation of names for the sake of control is nothing new. It has been done for centuries. It was a common practice for conquering nations to change the names of those conquered as a method of stripping away their identity. It was Sigmund Freud that brought further illumination to the importance of a name to a person's identity. Freud noticed that the association between a person and their name can be seen as the most rudimentary levels of communication, such as answering a phone or introducing another oneself. When answering a phone or introducing oneself, a person always says hello, this is, or I am. Rarely do we see or hear people introduce themselves by saying, hi, my name is. The phrase I am and this is are identifying clauses. We identify with our name. Because humans identify with our names impact how we view ourselves. It is our connection to our past and a direct link to our ancestors. When that link is abruptly broken, it has an immense impact on our sense and our knowledge of self. Separation from our history, and this will be the last one. This will be the last subsection. Yep, I'll stop here. Unfortunately, losing the sense of self that is associated with one's name was not the only factor that slaves had to grapple with in the battle to maintain their identity. Slaves were completely severed from their history. It was considered a crime punishable by death to discuss their history among themselves. Their white masters understood that their history was rich and powerful, and allowing slaves to develop a direct correlation with their history would prove counterproductive. However, robbing the slaves of their history was another link in the chain of psychological bondage and oppression. The white supremacy system understood that physical bondage could only be perpetuated over the long term when the minds of the oppressed were more bound by the limitations of poor self-esteem and an inferiority complex. It is important to realize that each of the issues that are being unfolded in this book has a dynamic that is so complex that it needs to be examined in detail in its own context. Chapters upon chapters can be written on the devastating impact of ripping away the history of a people. One of the most devastating and lasting effects of this is the existing lack of affinity that Blacks feel towards our own history, as well as the lack of passion invested in learning about our history. After several generations of disallowing Black slaves to participate in native religions or to discuss their history, the knowledge of self began to slip away until there was little left in the minds of the slaves to share with their progeny. To exacerbate the matter, the gap in the knowledge of their history left slaves immensely vulnerable to the interpolations of erroneous historical and religious concepts by whites. Black history was replaced with the European version of history, which favored those of European descent and placed Blacks in a negative and subservient light. In addition to the distortion of history, white slave masters also forced the whitewashed version of Christianity upon slaves. Although slaves were initially only allowed to attend church with their masters, eventually slave owners would select and ordain Black slaves as ministers. This vassal form of leadership proved to be one of the most pernicious mechanisms and vices of control during slavery. The ministers who were chosen and had displayed a high sense of loyalty to their masters, and they lacked the inherent traits of a natural leader, meaning they posed no threat to their masters. They were given specific instructions on what they were to teach and how it was to be taught. They received explicit instructions on how slavery was to be addressed from a biblical perspective. When slavery was mentioned by a Black ordained preacher, the slave was always to be Black and the master always white. Now, what's important here is, if you notice, they went out of their way to select those who appeared loyal, those who they didn't think would make trouble. Well, we know by the story of Nat Turner what happened when they failed to discern when one of those had a fire burning inside of them. They paid dearly for that. Okay. Additionally, another immeasurable force that was used to disengage slaves from any true sense of identity was the powerful force of imagery. Not only was Christianity forced upon them, but the image of a white Jesus and an image that was representative of their oppressor was also an incessant force that they had to deal with. When you cannot relate to the God that you serve, it leads to an identity crisis. When the God you serve resembles your oppressor, it sends a message that your oppressor is innately superior. It also sends a message that your oppressed state is your lot in life. You were designed to be a servant. And that is the end of it for today. The next section we're gonna get onto is the introduction of a new language, how the taking of the language had a negative impact. Again, a great deal of research went off into understanding data, and it started with my journey, which was ignited by a lady by the name of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing in 1985. My junior year in high school, Dr. Welsing was on the Phil Donahue show, and she was defending her Cress theory of color confrontation. She had not yet published the ISIS papers, which would come maybe about 7 years later. But I watched her, and this was on the heels, if you keep up with things, this was on the heels of a very troubling time for a young child like me who was constantly told how smart he was all through school, and viewed himself as being smart. You know, at that stage, that's what we call it, just say smart. But um, it was on the heels of this push in the late 70s and the early 80s that suggested black intellectual inferiority, that blacks were simply not as smart as white. They were born intellectually inferior to whites. And there was a push on that. And they were using um, common IQ scores to validate that. And obviously, thank God for some great black minds and some white ones. Um, they were able to dispute that and show why the disparity was and whatever. But this is on the heels of that. So this is 1985. This is on the heels of this big movement that, that suggests that black simply wasn't as smart as white. And here was this black woman on a national television show defending her theory, her dissertation theory, by the way, um, on color confrontation, which is highly radical. If you haven't read the Crest theory of color confrontation, it's radical. And here are white men who are supposed to be her peers or her colleagues, and she's holding her own. She's holding her own, and that from that point on, I'm like, okay, it was always going to be either law or psychology. And after I saw that, I'm like, psychology. And so then I began to question through Dr. Welsing. I became aware of Neely Fuller Jr. And from there, I became aware of Dr. Naeem Agbar. And from there, I became aware of Dr. Amos Wilson. And here come these great minds. And later, a little bit later on, I became aware of Dr. Joy DeGroot and Dr. Howard Stevenson. And these minds had a major impact on shaping mine and guiding me. And obviously, from a historical perspective, Dr. Yosef Ben Yakin and Dr. John Heinrich Clark, Asa Hilliard, and a bunch of others. But when it came down to the world of psychology and the way we think and our identity and how our children were being educated, this quest started a long time ago. This isn't new for me. This isn't something that I just jumped out and got on social media with. Long before social media was here, I was on this journey. And I was passionate about it. I wanted to be influential. I wanted to be impactful. I wanted to do something that I could leave behind that will give some insight and some illumination to what we're facing and why we're where we're at. That's why I can have the patience I have with my people. The name of this book is just think about it. Born in Captivity: Psychopathology as a Legacy of Slavery. What we have to realize is a bunch of things that now are in almost automatically considered a part of Black culture, really and truly is not inherent culture in the sense of that's us and that's where we come from. It is environmental culture in the sense that the traumas that we have experienced on an unbelievable level has been perpetuated down both epigenetically and through the process of social learning theory. We're simply living in an environment that's toxic, created by someone else, and we have developed behaviors that we perpetuate that are considered who we are, and it's not. It's not inherently cultural. It's not inherently genetic. What it is a process and a result of the nefarious forces moving against us in so many different ways that we can't possibly imagine, and I can't possibly go into detail on in one segment. But that's the thing. We have to reclaim, like Frantz Fanon said, is we got to liberate ourselves from ourselves. We have to literally get outside of ourselves and be able to see who we are in truth, and then liberate ourselves from what they've told us we are. We've got to liberate ourselves from the suggestions that are presented through slavery, the suggestions that are presented through 70 years of Jim Crow segregation, convict leasing, redlining, benign neglect, urban renewal, the black codes, so many things that placed us in positions that influenced how we saw each other and gave us an erroneous idea of who we were. Those are the things that we've got to escape from. We've got to escape from the suggestion that we're naturally inferior. We got to escape from the subliminal ideas and messages that tell us that we are naturally animalistic and aggressive, and understand that there are issues and environmental situations that influence that aggression, that if you place anybody in it, you're going to see it. There's an experiment that I studied a while back, and I revisited that earlier this year, but I studied it a while back. It's called Universe 25, where this one guy studied the behavior of rats over and over and over again. He would create this universe for them, and he would create it, and he would give them a bunch of space, and he would seed it with like maybe 6 rats. And, everybody say that, rats just multiply. But what he found is that in that closed environment, that when they first start out, they've got plenty of food. Each rat had their own condo. It's crazy. He started out building in on the farm, and eventually he moved to this universe and did his study. And they gave him this whole big space where he built it. It was square feet. I mean, it was huge. It was not just a little small thing. And what would happen is they would start out and they would peak in harmony at about 200, 250 is where they could all still get along, eat and share and be kind and groom each other and all the stuff that rats do. And then as it started to get higher, the population got higher, things would start to happen. And get about 400, what happened is they start breaking off into groups. Some groups would stop mating. Other groups, there was an entire group that became totally same sex, that they only humped males, females only had females. So they became basically homosexual. And so they couldn't reproduce because they would not mate. Then there were others who became consumed with themselves. They would literally sit up all day long, eat and groom themselves. They did nothing else but eat and groom themselves. They didn't have sex. They didn't do anything. So their ability to reproduce. So there were different things that were affecting their ability to reproduce, which is the number one rule of survival. You have to sustain the population by procreating. Well, they stopped procreating. Then there was another group that became hostile and violent. And it seems to be the group that initially was the one that was pushed off and wasn't allowed to have the food. So they became the most violent. They started to take, they started to hurt, they started to maim, they started to kill. And what happened is the population would get down to, I think, 130, 140 something. It happened he did this about 20 times. And it would get down to 120 something. But once it got down that time where, okay, everything kind of leveled off and it was plenty food, plenty space, it never got back over 175 because they had trained themselves not to procreate, to be self-consumed. All the negative things that destroyed them was still there in their psyche. None of the issues that caused the strife were there anymore. They had plenty of space, plenty of food, but they had already trained themselves how to be destructive. And it was embedded in their psyche. And there's so many other experiments that we could talk about. There's so many other studies that we could talk about. But what I'm trying to get us to understand is, we can't just sit up, look at ourselves and go, oh my God, shake my head. And I talked about this in the last video, that we have to realize that there's a force behind this. There's a reasoning behind this. This isn't something that's just sitting there. We've got to truly understand the magnitude of what we're dealing with so that we can overcome it. Um, I'm just not seeing this, Cheryl. So if you did see it, this book is book number 19, and it's called Born in Captivity. There's actually a link in the description box. So once this actually the live stream is over, it'll be posted on YouTube, and if you're watching it on the Facebook channel, which is probably the Black Voice channel, it'll be there permanently, and so you can go there and check it out. But the name of the book is Born in Captivity: Psychopathology as a Legacy of Slavery. And one of the studies I did, and coupled with research, was an examination, and I think I said this before, on something I called collective cognitive bias syndrome. And it's where that is a bias towards an idea and it becomes a collective reality. And that's where something like an inferiority complex comes from. That because we live in an environment where we under the power of a white racial caste system, we tend to lend ourselves to the suggestions of that system. So when we talk about beauty, we tend to talk about beauty from a Eurocentric idea of what is. And then that bias becomes collective. It's not just a few of us that think that way. A large portion of us actually see white features as being more beautiful than black features. That's where self-hatred comes from. See, the self-hatred didn't just come out of being black. It came out of the idea that being black wasn't best, that being white was best. See, that's what happens when you integrate yourself into a system. But we got forced integrated into a system, and not on an equal basis. We got integrated into a system that used us for subjugated reasons. We became forced servants in a system that was not designed for us. It was a system to serve another people. And now that we have our quasi-freedom, we had our false liberation, our emancipation, we want to now integrate into that same system that had oppressed us. But there's no room for us there. Plus, it's not designed for us. Their idea of beauty is different than our idea of beauty. Their idea of class is different than our idea of class. Their idea of professionalism. We're built different. We're genetically the same in a lot of genetic type ways, but there are a lot of things in our thinking. For one, it's been shown that we have a larger pineal gland. Well, the pineal gland is the source of central source of spiritual energy and spiritual force. It's where you get your discernment. It's where you get so much of what makes us special. It's the producer of melanin. It's all of these different things, and we have a larger pineal gland, and it comes with some things other outside of melanin. And we need to understand who we are, but we are so busy chasing the Eurocentric idea that we don't have a clue of what the Afrocentric idea is and why we would thrive in it. So we fight it. We literally defend the system. And this is, again, what Frantz Fanon was talking about. This is what Carter G. Woodson was talking about. We will literally defend the system that's oppressing us because we have a belief that that system is what's holding us together. That system's. How many talk and complain all the time about how this government oppresses us and lose their freaking mind the moment it looks like the government is about to fold? That's because it's been indoctrinated in us. The very thing that's destroying us, we don't want to see fold. So we have to liberate ourselves from ourselves. We have to become aware of who we are inherently, innately, not what we've been made into, but who we are. And then we have to start nurturing that. We have to start resisting the idea of trying to be something we're not. We have to be not just okay with being who we are. We have to be in love with being who we are. That's the goal. This idea of liberation is so much more than being able to walk around where you want to walk around and go where you want to go and get a job. That's an illusion of a liberation. Means that I am in control of my existence. It means that I can decide I want to make a move, and I can make that move because not only do I have the right to do it, I have the resources to do it. And the resources are far more than money. The resources are the right mentality, the right focus, the right connectivity, the right connection to my brothers and sisters. We have an issue with connectivity because we have had individualism pushed on us at a level that you cannot possibly imagine. We've been literally purposely conditioned to think about ourselves on an individual level before we see ourselves on a collective level, because that is what scares them. When asked in the late 60s or the early 70s, when J. Edgar Hoover was asked what is the greatest threat to American security, his response was Black unity. The thing that that man feared more than anything was Black people coming together. That's still a fear. That's why there's so many different elements and components at play to keep us distracted, to keep us focused on the wrong thing, to keep us aimed with our anger at one another. And so what we have to do is we have to sit up and make up in our mind that we want to be truly liberated. That means to execute our right to be us, and to be us in our holistic self, and to be able to stand on our own. And that requires a level of collectivism, because there are those that still need us to guide them, still need us to help them, still need us to resource them. We need to be resourcing our own businesses. We need to be resourcing our own programs. We shouldn't be asking the government for anything. We shouldn't be asking them for anything, period. There's enough for us to put into ourselves, but we would have to stop spending a great deal of what we spend with them. And that's a problem for most of us. Why? Because we're still not liberated in our mind. We're still trying to prove that we belong. And we think we can prove that we belong by buying what they buy, especially if we have a little money. You know, uh, man, I'm gonna go get that bag. Man, I'm gonna go get those shoes. Man, I'm gonna go. Why? Because when they see me with this, they're gonna know I got a little something. And the thing is, at the end of the day, no matter how much money you have, you're still gonna be Black. You cannot get out of that. You're going to have to understand that you're going to be Black no matter what. Your Blackness precedes you in every situation, every circumstance, everything that gonna go through in life. You walk in a room, your Black beats you in the room. So you better become real comfortable with it. You better fall in love with it. You better embrace its power. Start walking in it, because it's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. And that's what I see a lot of us doing. A lot of us are uh, a lot of us are sitting there and shrinking ourselves in order to make them feel comfortable. You know, the moment you start having a conversation and one of them is anywhere near, don't want to make them uncomfortable. Learn how to walk in your truth. Learn how to live in your truth. Learn how to be who you were truly designed to be. Embrace it, and then show others how to do it. That is something that you have to be able to do. Again, I want to thank you guys for dropping in on these readings. I will continue to keep them coming for you. I hope they spark conversations. I hope that we can gain a sense of momentum and unity. Again, if you want to get the book, the link is going to be in the description box. You can Google it, but if you want to get the book directly and have it signed, just hit that link, and I will have one brought to me signed and shipped out. Also, there's work that we need to do, and also in the description box will be a way that you can give um, to show your love for the work that we do at the Odyssey Project. As I said with the last video, Black Men Lead is a rite of passage initiative for young Black males. We start at 4 and we keep them in the circle to their 30, and then hopefully by 30 they become mentors. That's the goal with that. Restoring Ghetto's Forgotten Daughters is a work that my wife started that I assist her with, and we work with young Black girls, young Black women, everything from rescuing them from sex trafficking, helping them heal, dealing with young girls who have been caught up and are now in the juvenile system, dealing with young mothers who are going through and dealing with domestic violence. We do that. So we help both our male and females. We deal with the elderly. Right now, like I was saying in the last video, on average, I get about 4 or 5, maybe 6 emails or text messages a day about young girls who are missing. We're doing a horrible job in taking care of our children. And that's a goal here, is to prepare our kids, is to protect our kids. We keep putting and exposing our kids to this hostile environment before they're prepared to deal with it. And it just destroys them. It eats them up, it chews them up, it spits them out. We've got 1 million of our men in prison. Yes, they made choices. Many of them, a lot of them we're starting to find are coming out, didn't do what they were in there for. But let's just talk about the ones who are in there for doing something that they shouldn't have done. That behavior came from somewhere. At some point, they were exposed that they did protect. They weren't born criminalized. That propensity towards doing what they do or what they did, unless they were a psychopath or even a sociopath, then we're talking about a very, 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 very small percentage of people. So the vast majority of them were not born that way. So then their environments are creating them. And who is responsible for their environments? The elders at the time. We've got to do a better job of providing the right environments for these kids to be completely socialized in a way that they are prepared to go out into this world and win. That's on us. We can say what we want to say. We can look down on them, but we are failing. And it's time for us to do something about it. On that note, I'm gonna get ready to get out here. Like I said, if you believe in the work we're doing, show some love. If you want the book, like I said, it's over 400. I don't see it. 420 something pages. It's like I said, it goes in depth and into this whole makeup of our mind and how it works. But I think that the average reader can understand it. The thing is, we better find ourselves. We better find ourselves, or a couple of more decades, and we will be so irrelevant in this country that there will be no hope. We need to come to a point where we start to make our presence felt. And on that note, I'm gonna get ready to get out of here. Again, thank you guys for stopping in and listening to the reading of this particular book. And like I said, that was not the complete chapter for 11. An identity crisis. We're going to complete it. Probably do some more on tomorrow morning. But on that note, I'm gonna get out of here. The next reading I'm gonna do another one today, but that's going to be more on personal development. It'll be reading from my book, Critical Mass, the Phenomenon of Next Level Living. And that's more about self development, but I'm going to bring that probably in another hour or so. On that note, you guys have a great day.